Good afternoon. Bonjour. Je m'appelle Paul Kennedy. My name is Paul Kennedy. And I think unlike most of the people in this room today, je suis pas un médecin. I'm not a doctor. Although I think my parents would have liked me to follow that route rather than the one that I followed down into the sleazy slopes of journalism. Je suis animateur d'une émission radiophonique qui s'appelle Ideas. I'm the host of a radio program called Ideas on CBC Radio 1. And it has been my great pleasure for the last 8 years now to be part of the celebrations surrounding the Henry G. Friesen Prize in Health Science Research. We have broadcast not the actual proceedings of any of the sessions that you'll be attending or have been attending so far. We have broadcast an interview that I have performed with each of the lecturers down through the years, and that will be no exception this year. If this year's laureate, Harvey Fineberg, can survive the ordeal that he is being put through in the last, well, so far half of this day, but it continues on into tomorrow. I think there's a medical maxim that says something like, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. By tomorrow afternoon, when I get to do the interview with him, he will be a powerhouse. It's amazing what they're put through. Other than that, I can tell you that one of the reasons I'm very excited to be here today and to be host of this particular public forum is the title of the presentation you're about to hear. You can imagine, as host of a program called Ideas, I'm very excited to hear that the power of an idea is going to bring ideas to power. A really exciting concept for me. My job here is pretty well as a sort of policeman or traffic manager, and my first great thrill this afternoon is to introduce Dr. Abby Angel, who is the sort of major inspirational and energetic force behind this entire event and the prize in general. Dr. Angel.
Thank you very much, Paul. I truly appreciate your participation once again. You've been very much part of this since its inception, and by extending and expanding the impact nationally through Ideas, you add another dimension to a larger proportion of society. I understand the Ideas audience is some 300,000 plus people across the nation, which is a wonderful audience. Chers mesdames et messieurs, je m'appelle Dr. Harvey Angel, président des Amis de IRC. C'est avec plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui pour le forum public de Prix International Friesen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harvey Angel, and I am the president of Friends of CIHR, and it's a great pleasure to be here for the 2013 Friesen International Prize Public Forum. Every year, the audience turns up over about 75%, so it's always worthwhile reminding ourselves about what Friends of CIHR is and what the Friesen Prize is. Friends of CIHR was established in 2000 to advance the goals and ideals of CIHR, to establish partnerships in the community, and thereby promote a better understanding and appreciation of the importance of health research in society, to increase the level of discourse and understanding of health issues broadly, and to encourage young trainees and support their development as future health scientists. And for those of you who are in the session just preceding this, in collaboration with CSCI, Brent Winston, president, is here. You'll see just a wonderful and advanced event that was, and the quality of the science was there, and it was very, very well attended, and they are part of this audience today, which is a marvelous collaboration. The Henry G. Friesen International Prize in Health Research represents a major initiative, and we are delighted to celebrate this award today as part of the annual Friesen Prize program. I thought it would be of interest to explain what Friends of CIHR actually is involved with. And there are three major areas of activity. We participate with a variety of partnerships to explore our projects and programs of collaboration at the community level. And I list those with whom we've collaborated. We are very much part of the CHS activities, and Dr. Fineberg will address the Canadian Academy of Health Science, which has been a wonderful sponsor and supporter of the prize. CSCI, I've mentioned, Mars, University of Manitoba, CBC Ideas, and Massey College. The Friesen International Prize is another major endeavor, and this is very much part of that program, and you see the way that prize is expanded into institutional visits, which I'll explain in a moment, but that represents an extension of the prize program. Recently, we've embarked and expanded on the video history of medicine in Canada in collaboration with a number of institutions in the country, featuring iconic figures in Canadian biomedicine. And through that initiative, we've established interesting partnerships and programs with Robarts Library, U of T, and iSchool at the University of Toronto. So Friends of CIHR has expanded its activities to involve a wider community that has become national. Now, it's always interesting to look at the previous prize winners, a very distinguished, somewhat elite group of individuals who've graced this event in prior years and who've provided very interesting and important contributions to our discussion and understanding of science in the world. Last year, Mark Tesla-Levine was here. It began in 2006, the inaugural lecture, Joe Martin, then John Evans, Harold Varmus, very distinguished Sir John Bell, Regis Professor, Shirley Tillman, Victor Zhao, Mark Tesla-Levine, all except John Evans working elsewhere, but all of them with important connections to Canada. Joe Martin, of course, grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. He was at MNI. John Bell grew up in Alberta as well, did very well. Shirley Tillman, also Canadian, did her graduate training at Queen's. Victor Zhao at McGill, and Mark Tesla-Levine, all of whom did exceptionally well in their professional careers with deep roots and experience in Canada. So while this is an international initiative and award, the people that we actually identified just by chance had very strong Canadian connections. Now, these people were not only recognized for their contributions, but they've had a legacy and a lasting relationship, because many of them have agreed very willingly to continue to serve in a consultant capacity and relate to programs in Canada over the years. So the role and impact of the prize has done more than simply identify outstanding individuals, but in fact encourage continuing collaborations and interactions, and that's a wonderful outcome as far as we are concerned. Now, one of the most important things one of the important spin-offs, of course, is to make sure that we record and immortalize the ideas, the vision, the concepts of our laureates and the talks that they give, and we publish their the proceedings. This is volume 3 of the lot, and Victor Zhao and Mark Tesla-Levine are here features, and this is just published and will be available at the end of the month. And this is a wonderful compilation of outstanding essays in science and of lasting interest, but it really reveals thinking of the day, and I encourage you to read up on these. I mentioned the institutional visits that have been going on right from the beginning in a modest way initially. Our laureates have willingly participated under the terms of the Friesen Prize to visit other institutions to bring the message, the thought, the ideas to other communities, in addition to coming to Ottawa or whatever center these events occurred. Joe Martin went to the University of Manitoba. John Evans willingly went to the University of Alberta, McMaster University, his home and birthright in a sense as founding dean of medicine there. Harold Varmus, after Toronto, went to UBC. Sir John Bell went to McGill MNI. And it's interesting that some institutions bestowed named lectureships. Wilder Penfield Lecture for John Bell. Shirley Tillman was at Queen's. Victor Zhao, UBC. Mark Tesla-Levine, U of Ottawa, and the University of Toronto gave the Oliver Smithies Lecture. Kathy Whiteside presided, and thank you, Kathy, for the support there. And Harvey Fineberg spent noontime today at the University of Ottawa. And so the institutional visits and prize activity has been expanded this year, and we've been very fortunate to have Alberta Innovates Health Solutions collaborate with us in the partnership way to support the Western Tour and the University of Manitoba as well. And in 2014, Dr. Fineberg, for his efforts, has been awarded the opportunity to go to the University of Manitoba in January, University of Calgary in March, Alberta in 2014. And I acknowledge Alberta Innovates Health Solutions for doing this. But this represents the way in which this sort of prize has achieved one of its goals, which is to be seen to be and operate at a national level. I think it's important to identify and acknowledge our partners with like-minded institutions over the years. Our collaborations have been organic and not one-off, but for 2, 3, or 4 years. Earlier on, with partners in research at the Ottawa Evening and fundraising activities with CIHR and the YI Forum, and with the Canadian Academy, of course, and the Friesen Prize, CSCI, CTAC, the annual scientific meetings. This has been going on now for 4 or more years with Mars and the Video History Project, McGill Video History, U Manitoba Video History, U of Toronto Robarts, and CBC Radio 1 Ideas from the beginning. And so you see how our partnerships have evolved over time into the community, into institutions that have exponential impact on how we relate. I'd like to end off briefly by just mentioning the third area of activity, the Video History of Medicine in Canada initiative. I mentioned this last year in some detail and explained that we have embarked on an initiative to record for archival for research purposes, journalistic purposes, the personal histories of major individuals who've contributed so much to Canadian biomedicine, to clinical research, clinical investigation, and clinical care over the years. This is just the beginning, but individuals like Charles Hollenberg, Henry Friesen, who's here today, Robert Salter, Lou Siminovich, John Evans, Jacques Genet, Cal Stiller, Fraser Mustard. We remember fondly Hollenberg, Salter, and Mustard who passed from, but we now have 5 to 6.5 hours of in-depth video recordings of their experience. And more recently, we've embarked and completed the digital archival basic material on James Till, Charlie Scriver, and Brenda Milner. This is just a beginning, but it's one of our major initiatives, and we're very pleased with that. And now I've completed my task to introduce you to what Friends of CIHR does and what the Friesen Prize is, and I'll hand the podium back.
Thank you, Abhi. I just want to say at this point, it seems like a natural collaboration between the folks who are organizing this and the radio program I represent, in that in this particular forum particularly is a place where the most elevated thoughts are not translated but are transmitted to a much wider audience, to a larger public audience. And for that reason, it seems like a natural and quite good fit, and I'm very proud to be part of it and have been proud throughout the years. Can I now ask Tom Murray to come forth and present greetings or words from the CHS?
Thank you. Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, I would like to welcome Dr. Fineberg to Ottawa and to thank him for coming. This has been a very good partnership, and it gets better every year, but this is a special year for us because Dr. Fineberg was very helpful when we were starting the Academy of Health Sciences, and Dr. Whiteside, who is directly in front of me, and Dr. Armstrong, if I remember correctly, you went to Washington to get some advice as for how to proceed. So we think with this visit, we're going to continue to grow that relationship. So thank you very much. And we're looking forward to your lecture.
And now can I invite my friend, I guess, actually, Bruce McManus, and I shared a cab and met one day in that context. And can I ask Bruce to come forth and to introduce this afternoon's speaker?
Thanks very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I paid for that cab, and that's why we're friends, but friends of CIHR. But it's a delight to be here, really to welcome all of you, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, citizens, especially Dr. Henry Friesen, in whose bright light I would say we're cast today, and also Dr. Mary Wilson, the accomplished wife of our Friesen laureate, with whom we've had the pleasure of discussions today and last night as well. On behalf of the Friends of CIHR and collaborating organizations and agencies that Abhi has nicely outlined, it's a great privilege for me to introduce the 2013 recipient of the Henry G. Friesen International Prize in Health Research, Dr. Harvey Fineberg. And when I was listening to you earlier, Paul, I was thinking of metaphors. One of the students in the previous session talked about people using too many sports metaphors, but in terms of the stamina and resilience one needs in order to just move through this one day of the Friesen activities, I was thinking of Jim Furyk and PGA Golf and the advertisement for 5-hour energy. The only difference is you'd need 2 bottles, at least. We've had, that's just an aside, we've had wonderful dialogues and discourses in sessions earlier today at the Leaders' Breakfast and also at the University of Ottawa, as mentioned. And through that, we've been gaining a glimpse of Dr. Fineberg's seasoned and sensible brilliance in guiding health policy formulation and also dissemination by the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies of Sciences in the United States. And Dr. Fineberg's wise and leavened leadership of the IOM since 2001 has yielded literally hundreds of blue ribbon, scrutinous assessments on policy issues central to public health that extend far beyond one society and around the world. Dr. Fineberg's own scholarship and policy development work reaches from the implications of health technologies to the efficacy and safety of vaccines and to health sciences and medical education. The central thread running through his scholarship and inquiry speaks to the processes of decision-making in medical care, in public health practice, and in health policy. Indeed, he founded and served as the president of the Society for Medical Decision-Making and authored a treatise on clinical decision analysis. Prior to bringing his clarity, his integrity, humility, his passion, and wisdom to the IOM, Dr. Fineberg served as provost of Harvard University, and before that as dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, the latter for 13 years. And he has served as the president of the Association of Schools of Public Health in the United States and has consulted widely, including with the WHO. He is what I would call Harvard Crimson through and through, with the Arts Baccalaureate, the MD, the Master's in Public Policy, and the PhD, all from Harvard University. Recognition of his many fine contributions is illustrated by several honoris causa, the Stephen Smith Medal from the New York Academy of Medicine in regards to his contributions to public health, and the Frank A. Calderon Prize in Public Health from the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in 2011. The latter award is considered to be the pinnacle of awards in public health. Dr. Fineberg today, just now, offers his clinical, scholarly, and policy perspectives and insights to us as the Friesen Prize laureate. He will address this interesting topic, the power of an idea to bring ideas to power. And Dr. Fineberg, our warmest welcome, our most sincere congratulations. We look forward to your remarks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Bruce, for that very warm and very generous introduction. I am absolutely delighted to be here with all of you. I owe a great debt of thanks to Abby Angel for all of the arrangements and help in setting the background and making this all possible, and I'm greatly looking forward to not only today and tomorrow, but to the additional visits to universities around Canada. And it's a special treat to be here receiving the Henry G. Friesen Prize with Henry G. Friesen himself in the room, which really, Henry, you are the prize for Canada in health research. Your achievements, the leadership that you demonstrated, and the ways in which you showed it was possible always to do more than anyone could have expected in the service of science and health is a model for all of us. And I just want to say how delighted and honored and thrilled I am to receive this prize in your name. I have to confess to you that my own connections to Canada are mainly through affection rather than residence. I couldn't help but notice as I wandered around the market that there's a shop that features Obama cookies. I'm not making this up. And in front of the shop is a quotation from our President Obama that expressed very succinctly my sentiment. He said, "I love this country." And I love this country even though I didn't even buy a cookie. You know, Canada is an extraordinary place. You really think about it, you could have had the best of all possible worlds. I mean, you could have had the British form of government, French culture, and American entrepreneurship. Instead, you got the French form of government, American culture, and British entrepreneurship. So it didn't quite mesh. But regardless of the past, any thinking person has to see Canada as a country of the future. If you just think about climate change, climate warming, while so much of the world is threatened, and maybe some along the coasts of Canada would suffer. Canada has all the fresh water you could possibly want. Some estimates say 1/5 of the freshwater reserves of the world here in Canada. You've got the boreal forest that stretches literally from coast to coast. You've got all the petroleum reserves you could want. You're going to have a longer growing season. I mean, about the only mistake you might have made is buying all that waterfront property in Florida. But other than that, you're really well positioned for the future. And it's a great honor for me to be here in Ottawa, to be with you, to share with you some reflections on a very basic notion, and that is a single idea that emanated in the United States to establish a national academy with the specific purpose of giving scientific advice to decision makers. That was the idea. And in the course of these comments, I want to share with you why that was such a powerful idea, how it has expressed itself particularly in the work of the Institute of Medicine, where I've been privileged to serve over the last nearly 12 years, and to think with you about some of the reasons that it may or may not be successful, I believe in a way that would be pertinent to thinking about similar activities here in Canada and in other parts of the world. Now, national academies in different parts of the world vary tremendously. And just if you hear that there's a National Academy of Science or Engineering or Medicine or something similar in a given country, that doesn't really convey to you enough about what it really is and what it does. Some of the academies basically are established for the core principle of preserving learning and the learned disciplines. In fact, if you look at the statement of purpose for the Royal Society in Canada, as an example, you'll find something very, very similar to that, even though the Royal Society now is a part of the Council, which together with all other related scientific and medical academies is serving not simply an honorific and learned purpose, but a purpose also of advice. The scope of fields that are covered vary quite widely. Some academies are defined, for example, as academies of arts and sciences, or sciences and humanities. They extend their reach. In the US model that I'll be talking about, the original National Academy of Sciences was limited to the sciences, but including, of course, the social sciences as well as the natural sciences. The academies differ in the way they elect members and have members. In some places, you've got to have someone die before someone else is elected. It's very restricted in number. In other places, it's a little more open. There's a certain number of places per year that will fill. That's the model in our US academies. One of the very distinctive features in the US that I'll be describing is that all of our academies of sciences and engineering, our Institute of Medicine, our National Research Council, we're actually all legally integrated as all falling under the original charter that I'll describe in a moment to the National Academy of Sciences. And while many academies in most parts of the world are an extension of government, if not literally a branch of government, one of the features that we feel is quite significant and important in the US model is the separation from government. And I'll come back to why that is quite important. Some academies are kind of combinations of councils of research and research institutions. They actually conduct huge amounts of research in their countries. The Russian Academy is a good example. Others are not directly involved in wet labs or bench research. Rather, they are more involved in synthetic assessments and advice, and this is more the picture of our US Academy. If you tried to think about the difference of academies around the globe, this depicts kind of a difference between the traditional science academy and the activist science academy. I'd like to think that at least we in the Institute of Medicine and the situation in the US try to keep both our eyes open and our heads off the table at least most of the time. But academies themselves sometimes fall into a kind of desultory state in which they're not very actively engaged. And I'll be talking to you about why it matters that academies do stay and become actively engaged in active interaction with decision makers. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences charter that dates back to 1863. 1863 was the height of the United States Civil War. This was in March. It was several months before the decisive Battle of Gettysburg. It was the last day of the session of the Congress, and Senator Wilson of Massachusetts introduced a resolution to establish a new National Academy of Sciences. And the charter that set up this academy is very interesting in that it states explicitly the purpose, which is that the academy shall, whenever called upon by any department of the government, investigate, examine, and report upon any subject of science or art. Now, the word art at the time meant the applied arts. It was more what we would use technology to explain today. And the charter went on to say that the academy shall receive no compensation whatsoever for any services to the government of the United States. Now, I'm not sure why that last provision was added. I can tell you that it might have been a reaction to exploitation of the war circumstances that many other suppliers to government were then enjoying during the required mobilization for the Civil War. But it did establish a very important principle that has actually been quite important from the beginning in the operation of our academies. It set them up as a separate body, independent of the government. The charter established it as an independent body. The idea that it was there to respond to needs of government, not to celebrate learned disciplines, but to respond to needs, introduced a service ethic from the beginning. The fact that no individual who served to answer the need would be paid introduced the notion of volunteerism. And the academies were established from the beginning to embrace the whole spectrum of the sciences, an important principle that was later extended to engineering and to medicine. In the early days, the academy was called upon to undertake some important studies. In fact, the first study that was requested to the new academy came in a letter just about a month after it was established in April of 1863. It was written by President Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase. And he was writing to invite the Academy's views on the subject of uniformity of weights, measures, and coins considered in relation to domestic and international commerce. So the Academy set about doing this work. They went and visited countries all over Europe, mainly. They came back, they took 3 years, and they reported that they could find no system superior to the French metric system. So this established a pattern we've been trying to live down ever since. It took twice as long as expected, and its recommendation had relatively little effect on the US system of weights and measures. But I can say that about 150 years later, we're still waiting for the metric system to take its full effect in the US. Now, there were some other studies that did have much more influence in that early period. If you think about it, the US Civil War was the time when the first ironclad ships were engaged in active battle. And there were a few problems with ironclad ships. For example, how do you keep the hulls from rusting in salt water? And how do you navigate with a compass when it's surrounded by iron? So the Department of the Navy turned to the National Academy to solve these and some other problems, and the Academy indeed did come back with some very practical and effective solutions, both to preserve the hulls and to establish mechanisms to shield the compasses so that they could navigate. Now, I'm going to jump ahead quite a lot in history to the time of the establishment of the Institute of Medicine, which followed the establishment of the National Academy of Engineering, that in 1964, and the Institute of Medicine in 1970. We expressed the mission of the Institute of Medicine in a way that's reminiscent of that early charter. We say that the Institute of Medicine serves as advisor to the nation to improve health, that the Institute is an independent nonprofit organization that works outside of government to provide unbiased and authoritative advice to decision makers and to the public. And we further state that the mission embraces the health of people everywhere. So advisory to whom? To government, to be sure, but also to decision makers in the professions, directly to the public, to civic leaders, and from time to time to our sister academies working in collaboration. Now, the Institute of Medicine and its parent organizations and the national academies are different from many other advisory bodies in a number of significant ways. First, it does enjoy this special charter from the US Congress that established its purpose. Secondly, In the US context, there are organizations that are sometimes established to give advice to a particular agency, but the National Academies, the Institute of Medicine, are unaffiliated with any single government agency. They have a breadth that can work as we do with the Department of Defense, Environmental Protection, Health and Human Services, Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, and so on. Very importantly, there's no direct appropriation from the US Congress to underwrite the costs. I have to confess, when I began, I thought that was an oversight and a deficiency. But I've since learned that it's a very important protection and a guardian for independence. Fourth, we at the Institute of Medicine are concerned with everything that relates to health. If the question bears on health, we're interested in considering it. We're not just a bipartisan organization. We strive to be apartisan, apolitical, not related or connected in any way to partisan politics. We pay scrupulous attention in all of our work to what we call conflict of interest and bias. And these concepts to us are very important and very central, and they differ, and they may differ a little from the usual common sense understanding of these terms. When we talk about a conflict of interest, we mean essentially a conflict of a financial type that may be affected by whatever the study is concerned with. Sometimes there are other conflicts around fiduciary responsibilities that an individual may have. For example, even if you are working as a board member for a nonprofit organization that may be affected by a study, you have a fiduciary conflict of interest in the results of that study, so you, in our terms, wouldn't be able to participate in it. We try to, as far as we can, eliminate conflicts of interest in the work that we do. Bias, in our terms, is simply a preformed opinion or preformed view. And bias is part and parcel of what every expert brings to a subject that they've already studied, thought about, and come to conclusions about. So we ask people not to be free of bias. We ask them to expose their predisposed thinking. We ask them to be able to come with an open mind to new evidence and to be able to participate in the discussions by listening as well as contributing. And in that way, we try to balance bias as we eliminate conflict of interest. We're actually, interestingly, protected in a curious way by a law in the United States called the Federal Advisory Committees Act, which is mainly designed to be a kind of transparency act for any agency of government that wants to establish an advisory committee. For example, if the National Institutes of Health establishes an advisory committee on a particular question of its own, all of the meetings of that committee must be held in public. They can have no executive discussion. We think for many of our purposes, when we've assembled the right group, we want them to be able to say things to one another that they're not sure about, that they do not want reported on the radio or in the newspaper, and that they won't have to backtrack on if someone calls them on it and why they have now come to a different conclusion compared to what they said 2 months ago in some meeting. So we preserve the opportunity for executive discussion as well as hold as many discussions as we can open in the public. But the Federal Advisory Committees Act essentially says to an agency, if you turn to the national academies, you can use their results and they can follow their process, even though if you did it yourself, you'd have to do it differently. That's a great advantage. But there's another provision that's even more valuable to us. In that same section of the law states that once an agency turns a question over to the national academies, they may not interfere in any way with the conduct of that work. Now that was put in as a means to avoid working around the transparency avoidance, just to prevent an agency from trying to shape an answer that it wants. But for us, it's an added measure of protection now in the law, which has always been part of our own process and policies, that we do not really accept outside influence on our process once we've gotten underway. I can tell you that in the 12 years that I've been president of the Institute of Medicine, there's not a single instance where I could relate even any remote attempt by a government spokesman or agency person to intrude on a study while it was in process. That I can't say exactly the same thing for all of my friends in academia or in other walks of life. They occasionally do want to make sure the study doesn't go off track in their view, but it really does help us in our relationships to government. And one other important feature for us is that any agency can decide if it wants the National Academies to do a study, it can contract directly with the Academies by executive order. It does not have to have an open bid process. And by the same token, it means that we at the Academies do not compete in open competitions for other work because we don't want to, in effect, play both sides of the street. We always undertake our work through direct contracting with an agency that asks us. Overall, at the Institute of Medicine, in our program, about 60% of our budget comes from public sources, from contracts and partial support or complete support for study from an agency, and about 40% comes from private sources, mainly from foundations and some individual contributions. Now, this individual has the protest sign that I like best. What do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review. Now, that's the kind of action I can stand behind. But really, I use it as a way of emphasizing that all of the work that we strive to provide is only valuable insofar as it can be grounded and is grounded in evidence and in scientific fact. So we always attempt to base everything we do on the scientific elements. Now, the kinds of things that we produce that are probably most familiar to those who are aware of the work of the Institute of Medicine and the Academies are the consensus reports that produce recommendations. Each year, dozens of these emerge. Each subject will talk about some examples, but they cover a complete range of topics in everything related to health. There are also a set of derivative products, which may be everything from a film to a chart to a web-based quiz to other activities that promote the ideas and the recommendations within the report. We hold every year literally dozens of workshops and have now a dozen and a half forums that meet regularly. The forums are groups of individuals drawn from government, from industry, from academia, from the public, from the professions, who come together around a particular topic. And that's a source of dialogue, an opportunity to exchange ideas and to make progress in thinking. And finally, we've developed a set of written products that we call perspectives, which put forward the ideas of individuals mainly who are involved in these forums and roundtables, and attempt to disseminate more widely their ideas and what they're working on, and sometimes to invite others to join in. Over the years, I've come to appreciate that if we want to have a successful consensus study, there are really 6 key ingredients that go into making it successful. The first of these is the charge. You might take the charge for granted, which is the question that is being asked of the committee. But a charge has to be formulated in a way that is first answerable, secondly, can be based on evidence, third, has enough generality to allow the committee to think creatively, and enough specificity to require disciplined thinking, but not overly specified. And it must be clear and unambiguous. These are actually harder to achieve than you might think. But if you start off with a charge that is lacking in clarity, overly general or overly specific, or with a topic that can't be studied and based on evidence, then you start out with a big handicap. Secondly, we have found that the chair of any committee is really the crucial first appointee. And the chair is someone not who knows the most about the subject in the room, but who has the personal qualities and the ability to bring a group to consensus and to make sure that everyone's best efforts can be expressed in the course of the work. The formation of the committee is something we devote a lot of attention to, partly to avoid the things we want to avoid in conflicts, partly to balance biases, but mainly to achieve the balance of expertise and experience that the question demands. And from time to time, a committee will come back and ask us to add 1 or 2 people because they feel the need, after they've begun to deliberate, for types of background and expertise that are lacking at the outset. The staff that we can mobilize, and we're so fortunate to have an incredibly dedicated and skilled staff who work at the Institute of Medicine. Every employee, by the way, at the National Academies is an at-will employee. No one has a long-term contract. Everyone is there because they love what they're doing, they feel it makes a difference, and they enjoy the experience. But the staff match to the project and to the committee is a very important ingredient. If you start out on a study and you don't have enough resources or you don't have enough time to do the work that you're given, you start out with 2 other very big handicaps. In my experience, you can get by pretty well without any one of these. You can usually compensate for any one of these ingredients. If you're missing 2 of them, especially if one of those 2 is the chair, that's going to be a study that's in trouble. And if you've gotten a deficiency of 3 or more of these, that's a red flag, and you've got to pay a lot of attention early on and figure out how to fix it, because that is not going to be a happy result. Now, if there's one theme that I have personally tried to stress in the dozen years that I've been at the Institute of Medicine, it's that it's not enough simply to produce the best report in scientific and technical terms that sits on a shelf. When I started at the Institute of Medicine, I asked the senior staff if they could assemble for me some examples of our best work so that I could understand how we did what we did and what was good about it. And the deputy executive officer who took the assignment said, happy to do it, but within an hour he was back in my office. And I thought that was fast. I didn't realize I knew it was good, I didn't know the organization was that good. But actually he came back with a question. He said, what exactly do you mean by best? I was new, so I said, well, what do you mean by best? And he said, well, by best, do you mean the reports that are scientifically sound, articulated most effectively, and based fully on evidence? Or do you mean the reports that made the most difference in the world? So I said, I'd like both of those. So I got back 2 lists. And I'm very glad to say there was some overlap. But I learned from then that excellence in the science and the evidence does not necessarily guarantee impact. And we have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we measure and understand what effect we're having, what difference we're making. At first, I'll confess, I started by thinking we wanted to have a very detailed quantitative assessment. And I soon came to the conclusion that really we needed a combination of some quantification, but a certain amount of qualitative data. And we also came up with the notion of what we metaphorically drew a thermometer to represent degrees of impact, starting at the bottom, so to speak, with simply getting the word out or being recognized as spreading information. A little higher level of having the field be informed through articles and discussions at meetings and symposia. Higher yet is the ability to inspire action for legislation to be introduced, or advocates to succeed, or education to be changed. And finally, the idea of affecting change at the top, ultimately improving health outcomes, but along the way, developing and implementing laws, policies, practices, organizational procedures, and so on. So we've worked hard to measure that, and we've worked hard to reach the right audiences. This is a woodcut, actually, of Michael Faraday lecturing at the Royal Society in London in the 1850s. But it so happens that Prince Albert and his sons are seated in the audience. So he had the right audience at the time. And while we don't always lecture directly to the prince, we do like to think that we can bring the ideas to those in power. Now, I mentioned that there were these two lists and some overlap. So what is it that makes the difference for having an impact, as distinct from just being excellent in scientific technical terms? Well, I believe that excellence of the product is a part of it. Is it objective? Is it evidence-based, grounded in science, well-reasoned, understandable, thorough, persuasive? All of that matters, but from abundant experience, it is not enough. How timely is the report? Are the decision makers ready to act? How important is it and salient to them at that time? How relevant to the needs and interests? Does this report come up against contending values or interests, commercial interests, personal or religious values, or political interests? How effectively have you communicated? And can you increase the likelihood of effect by having more powerful and persuasive communication? Again, where the public media as well as the direct professional media come in. And one other thing that I have learned is that you very seldom accomplish the whole job with a single report, a single task. Oftentimes, it takes repetition. You come at the same problem from slightly different angles. You work on the problem, such as the fundamental problem of the quality of healthcare, by looking not only broadly, but at the quality of nursing care and the quality of diagnosis and the quality of long-term care. And quality comes back again and again and again, and ultimately you have more of an ability to drive the nail home when you strike it repeatedly. So consistency and repetition has turned out, in my judgment, to be a very important element in making the work have an impact. Now, I want to take a few minutes just to illustrate some of the work of the Institute of Medicine across 8 different kinds of purpose, not all uniquely distinct one to the other, some overlap, but it's a way at least that I've come to think about the work that we do. First, the Institute of Medicine works to bring new science to long-standing problems. Just one illustration from a period that was relatively early in the time that I began as president. Smallpox, fortunately, has been eradicated from the natural environment in the world, but there are stockpiles of smallpox. And it is possible through engineering, bioengineering, to create smallpox virus. So the question came up, what would it take to develop antivirals against smallpox, and how important would it be, and should it be done? So an ancient disease with a new question, and here we work to outline a research agenda. A paper out of this work was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that year. Another kind of example, ancient scourge of fungal diseases, but now an emerging threat in recognition to human health. Some of you may know that most fungal organisms have not even been classified biologically, much less studied. They have an extraordinarily wide impact on animals, on humans, on plant life, and they're often underappreciated and their effects are poorly understood. So this work of our Forum on Microbial Threats attempted to take this, again, ancient threat to health and raise the questions as to how we could deal with it more effectively as an emerging health problem. The Institute of Medicine confronts controversial questions of science and policy. And in a way, this is, to me, sometimes where the Institute shines, because it's unafraid to step up, take on issues that others are perhaps more reluctant to contemplate. One important series that turned out to be rather controversial had to do with our immunization safety review. The last of these studies began in 2001 and extended for the next 4 years. The last of them dealt with the question of autism and immunization, still a controversial question. I don't know how widespread in Canada you have resistance to vaccines, but there's pockets within the US where there's real indifference to resistance to taking and using vaccines. One of the reasons, of course, is the vaccines have been so successful, by and large, that people no longer see the pertussis or the measles and are therefore thinking that they're not really, and their children are not really vulnerable to it. But autism is especially controversial. It has this persistent sentiment in the public that something about vaccines must be related, in part because the age at which autism first manifests is often the same age at which children are immunized. And so you have some coincident cases. But when we looked at all the evidence, we found that there was no association that was scientifically grounded. This was not a universally popular conclusion. There was one congressman who invited his staff to come in because he was on the Appropriations Committee, and he asked to have the budget of the Institute of Medicine. And it was in response to that request that the staff member could come back and say there is no budget. That's a reason why not having that appropriation every year may be a good thing to protect that independence. Now, another case that we looked at actually was prompted a couple of years ago by a very unfortunate incident in a cancer clinical trial at Duke University, in which there was, in effect, a premature use of an omics-based screening test, classification test, to guide the clinical trial. And it turned out that the test itself was not properly validated. So our committee came together, prompted by this experience, to look more broadly at the whole evolution of translational omics and its value and reliability in predicting likelihood of response to different drugs and how to go about having a more sound and reliable basis for omics-based testing. And I think that this report over time is going to really shape a very important line of research, but was very controversial at the time. Another intensely emotional subject in the US was the use of chimpanzees in research. There were extreme views about this, some arguing that chimps were just another animal and we needed to use animals and we have to have animals protected in research and the scientific community depends on that. Others who said not simply those who are opposed to all animals in research, which is another significant group, but particularly that there are special things about our closest animal relatives, evolutionarily speaking, in chimpanzees. And the NIH was really in a bind as to what to do about sponsoring and carrying on research with chimpanzees. So they turned to the Institute of Medicine and asked the IOM to assess the evidence and to come back with recommendations about whether and under what conditions should you use chimps in research. Now, the committee did not propose an outright ban on chimp research, but they did come forward with very sharply demarcated reasons why you could use chimps. First, they said it's got to be based on a study where the knowledge gained is essential to advance public health. Secondly, it has to be a circumstance where there's no other animal model and where it is unethical to apply the research to a human population. And finally, they said if you're going to use chimps, you have to maintain the chimps in an ethologically appropriate physical and social environment. Now, those standards were rapidly adopted by the NIH. They discontinued a range of research projects, and they estimated most recently that they would probably need a colony of only about 50 or fewer chimps to meet the needs under the standards that were set forward by the IOM committee. And this was a report, we do some reports that actually please no one. This report in a lot of ways was viewed with relief, I would say, on all sides, because people were afraid on the one side that it would just be a pure science, let's do anything we want, or on the other, we've got to stop altogether. And I think the committee did a quite brilliant and balanced and evidence-based job. Here was a case where the Congress was very concerned about differences in payment through our Medicare program in different parts of the United States. It turns out that if you look at Medicare costs for a given procedure in the United States, there's typically a 2.5-fold variation in the amount that it will cost in one place or another to do the same procedure. Now, this has been talked about for a long time as geographic variation. And a certain caucus in the Congress, particularly as you might imagine from states that were the relatively less costly states, they were thinking about introducing legislation that would mandate geographically based variations in payment that would help bring all those payments into closer alignment. But they did ask the Institute of Medicine to take a look at this proposition. And what our committee found is that there were these significant differences, but they continued to have significant differences no matter how small a region you looked at. So that regional variation by state or regional variation by county or even by sub-region within a county, there was still a lot of variation. The lesson being that the variation was institution and practitioner based, not really a geographically based variation. It turned out, out of this set of very important studies, that about 70% of the variation in the payment for Medicare patients, in the US these are patients that are 65 and older, was related to post-acute care differences. That's differences in what happens to the patient after they're discharged from hospital, what duration of rehabilitation and what type of rehabilitation, et cetera, they have. That was a very interesting, important insight. Interestingly, for the non-Medicare population, the group with private insurance, by and large, based on employment in the US, below age 65, 70% of that variation across regions was variation in the prices paid for the same entities. So some places were just much better purchasers than others, or some institutions had much more market power to influence the price that would be paid, either from the hospital side or from the insurer side. And that set of insights was very important, still playing out in policy terms, but it did deter, the report did deter the movement toward geographic-based variation in payment alone toward a system that would be much more based on the institutional performance and the provider performance, which when you reflect on it, does make a lot more sense. Another controversial topic, often ignored, the health of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, a topic many health professionals, never mind the lay public, doesn't want to talk about, much less really to think about. We undertook this study because it was evident that in many circumstances there was bias and neglect in the health needs of this population. And the committee did a very thorough, I think very careful, very important assessment. And their result was a renewal and extension of the interest in work at the NIH for research that would bear on the needs of the LGBT community, as it's called. And the committee also outlined a set of research needs specifically that might be followed, and this report has had a very good follow-up. Another very controversial topic: how much sodium should people take in? It's not a simple question. And it's an answer, there's an answer to it that some professionals feel very, very strongly about. Our committee, again, with people who had positions on this subject, who had done a lot of work on the subject, and some who had not, came together, took a fresh look at the evidence, and this committee came to conclusions that I would say did not comport with the expectations of the agencies sponsoring the study. And basically, they said that they could not find evidence to support reduction in sodium to extremely low levels, which were the levels being recommended. Now, I can tell you that this was not a universally popular report. In fact, the American Heart Association, very soon after this report appeared, came out and redeclared its conviction that very low sodium is in fact a good recommendation. But our committee found that it's not only a matter of indifference, but that for some populations, especially those with certain pre-existing conditions such as diabetes or kidney disease or even cardiovascular disease, that there was some evidence that very low levels of sodium could have adverse health effects. So the committee really has reset the debate on sodium. It's not a settled question, but I think this report is going to promote a very strong reassessment of how powerful is the evidence and how important is different kind of evidence to come to important policy recommendations and conclusions. The Institute of Medicine also takes up subjects that are being neglected. For example, the whole problem of health literacy. In the US, it's estimated that as many as 80 million adults have one degree or another of inability to understand enough about their healthcare and the directions from their healthcare providers to be able to take care of their own health. That's a pretty serious number. How many of us as practicing health professionals at the end of every encounter ask the patient, "Tell me back what I just told you"? If you try it, I predict you'll be surprised a lot of the time that they won't have an ability to tell you back what you just told them that you want them to do. And that should give us all pause. But this was another case in which the early study in 2004 has been followed up by a number of subsequent studies on various types of health literacy challenges. And we've in fact incorporated this problem into an ongoing forum and roundtable in order to maintain the kind of attention to it. Now, you may have heard that firearm-related violence is a problem in the United States. It's a huge problem. After the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut in December of 2012, this was the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre where 20 children and 6 teachers were killed by a gunman. President Obama basically had finally had enough, and he issued a set of 23 executive actions and executive orders that included directing the Centers for Disease Control to open up and revisit its program of research on violence prevention. And so the CDC turned to the Institute of Medicine and said, "Can you help us in a very short time? We need this in a matter of weeks to a couple of months. Can you put together a group of experts across the spectrum focusing on the question of research needs and give us a portfolio that we can take back in response to the President's directive?" And we did it. That set of research proposals focusing on gun violence, on protective factors and risk factors, on interventions and strategies, research on gun safety technology, and research on the influence of video games and on other media. When the White House released its progress report in response to the executive orders in April of this year, they cited the work of the Institute of Medicine, and we believe that it will be a big help to the Centers for Disease Control and over time to the nation in reducing the burden of firearm violence. The problem of obesity, another relatively underappreciated problem for many years in the United States, but the Institute of Medicine has been working on it in a variety of ways over a period of years. A couple of the most recent reports on accelerating progress in obesity prevention and evaluating obesity prevention efforts just appearing earlier this year are other important steps in bringing focused interventions to meet the needs of preventing and reducing obesity. Fourth purpose of the Institute of Medicine's work is especially to attend to needs of vulnerable populations. These include children, important studies on children's health, one that emerged just this year on new directions in child abuse and neglect. This is actually 20 years after the first Institute of Medicine report on the subject. It was looking at what progress has and has not been made. Tremendous focus in this report on the issue of neglect. It's still estimated in the U.S., in fact, it's still reported in the U.S. every year 6 million children are subject to abuse and neglect. The adverse effects over a lifetime are very well documented. And this study and other work specifically designed to improve the health opportunities of children is a very important part of our portfolio. Forthcoming a little bit later this year will be a study on the commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of minors in the United States. We know it's a problem globally. It's also a problem in the United States. And one that I know is going to be very controversial is sports-related concussion in youth. For us, it's often football, but those hockey players, I understand, once in a while touch each other on the ice. So it's a problem that we all have to be very much aware of. Veterans' health is another very important topic for the Institute of Medicine. The Gulf War experience is the first war in which the improvised explosive device is such a prominent feature of the war front experience. Because of protective armor and other protective equipment and clothing, more survivors are coming home, which is a great thing. But that also means that more individuals are coming back with cognitive needs, with traumatic brain injury, with post-traumatic stress disorder, and a whole set of studies around what we can do as a nation to fulfill our obligations to our military and veterans serving in this way has been an important series of studies at the IOM. Health disparities, looking at the needs of the underserved. In the United States, we had a series of studies on the uninsured leading up to the most recent efforts at extending insurance in the United States, but also even with insurance, as you've discovered in Canada. Having insurance is not alone a guarantee of access, nor is access a guarantee of equity in the care and treatment of every individual. And so it's a continuing and great challenge where the IOM repeatedly has done its effort to do more. Fifth, the IOM frequently is asked to conduct evaluations that will guide the development and direction of major programs. For example, in California, a few years ago, the state set aside a large amount of money, having expended already more than $1.3 billion, in an effort called the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine that was essentially designed to promote stem cell research. This was being done at a time when in the US nationally this was a very controversial subject, and California, voted by the public, decided that it would make this investment. But after a period of 6 years, the Institute came to the IOM to ask it to review its program, its operations, its strategies. And while the Institute of Medicine report was filled with praise for the scientific achievement, it also did make some very important recommendations to change the governance structure, some aspects of the program, and some of the policies, which subsequently have had their effect and been adopted. Another major program initiative in the United States, some would say the most successful health international effort in the history of the United States, the so-called PEPFAR program for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a program that has directed billions of dollars abroad in an effort to extend the benefits of treatment and increasingly prevention and indeed improvements in care more broadly. Still, the question was raised to the IOM, how well is this program doing and should it be renewed? This was at the time the Congress was first considering a renewal of the program. That initial report came forward in a positive way, encouraging the renewal. And just earlier this year, we released a report on a second analysis looking at what could be done now moving forward to improve further the effect of this program and supporting partner countries to take on more and more of their own responsibility and accountability for their HIV response. And that's a very important transition for the program, and we hope that this report will be very beneficial. We also were recently asked by the NIH to take a look at its Clinical and Translation Science Awards program, the so-called CTSA program. How well is it working? How should it be modified, if at all? And the committee again came back with a very thorough assessment after a number of site visits as well as discussions in Washington, and essentially reinforced the core of the program, but did recommend a number of important revisions which, interestingly, the NIH almost instantaneously accepted and is putting into place. The Food and Drug Administration in the United States was only in 2009 granted authority to regulate what are called modified tobacco products. These are products intended to affect the use of tobacco. And as a result, the FDA turned to the Institute of Medicine to get advice on what should be the standards for studies looking at this new class of interventions that it was being asked to examine, different from drugs, different from devices, not a hybrid exactly, something that they weren't sure how to deal with. And our report, I think, has been very helpful to the FDA. The second example here deals specifically with a congressional request that followed consideration of renewal of several pieces of legislation directed at drug development and availability for children, the so-called Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act. These studies were designed to help the FDA implement the requirements of this act. And indeed, the Congress took those studies into account and also directed the FDA to report by 2016 how it was implementing the recommendations that emerged from the IOM studies. The IOM is also called upon to recommend standards that will protect health. One of the areas that we have done this most prominently is in the field of nutrition, and very interestingly, this is something that is done in collaboration with our Canadian colleagues. Canadian representatives sit actively on these committees, and the standards on nutrition are therefore relatively uniform as they get adopted by the governments of the United States and Canada, which has been a tremendous asset. But the effort at the IOM is well beyond these so-called dietary reference intakes and extend across recommendations about the nutritional content of food packages for women, infants, and children, recommendations about weight gain in pregnancy, recommendations about nutritional content of school meals, which I'm very pleased to report particularly was adopted by the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in modifying the standards required for school meals, increasing the amount of whole grains, fresh fruits and vegetables, and reducing the amounts of fats and sugars in the school meals in a way that is, I think, going to be very salutary and have an impact even over time on the challenge of obesity that I mentioned earlier. We've looked at the special challenges of creating standards of care during times of crisis. The experience of SARS in Canada was a great example of a crisis. How exactly do you adopt and adapt to the emergency conditions? Where and when and in what ways do you accept some modifications of the ways in which you do things? We've had a series of committees looking at that in preparation and expectation of further natural and potentially human-induced emergencies that would have to be met with new standards of care. The Institute of Medicine has done a series of studies on guidelines about determining what works in healthcare, what the bases of systematic reviews should be, and also recommended ways in which clinical practice guidelines can be developed in a manner that would be more trustworthy and reliable. And those recent studies are garnering a considerable amount of attention. Seventh, the Institute of Medicine is frequently asked to bring innovative thinking to very complex and challenging problems. I was involved myself at a time before I became the president of the IOM in a set of studies on ranking vaccine candidates for priority development. Thinking about what are the needs for new vaccines in the United States and what were the needs internationally. And I can tell you that was a very complicated and challenging subject. One of the basic questions, for example, is how do you value a saved life at different ages? Is it the same, or do you value life years? Do you value the newborn the same as the 1-year-old? These are vexing, complicated, difficult problems. Well, in the most recent iteration of this work, in an effort that we call SMART vaccines, SMART is an acronym for Strategic Multi-Attribute Ranking Tool for vaccines. We're taking a fresh approach to the problem. Instead of saying, here's the committee's value judgments that apply to the science, and here's what we came up with, we're attempting to put together a web-based decision aid which is available and will be available to anyone who is thinking about vaccine priorities to be able to apply their own set of values, to be able to choose the sources and to emphasize variation and uncertainty that they want to introduce. And the model is set up to run and then to yield, based on those assumptions, what is then the appropriate choice of vaccine development priorities. Another example of solving a tough problem took a number of years, but has been very rewarding and satisfying. Globally, the challenge of treating malaria is still a very difficult problem. But a half a dozen years ago, it was even more complicated and more difficult. At the time, combination products, which were the treatment of choice by and large, cost about $4, which in a country where the annual income is measured in dollars, it's a very, very difficult standard to meet. And so our committee, which included economics and infectious disease and international health expertise, came together and figured out that there was a way, they believed, in which the international community could make focal investments to create a global subsidy fund that would make the new combination malaria treatments affordable. And it took a while, but ultimately the World Bank and others came along. They developed and adopted essentially the idea. And today, that $4 treatment is down to about 40 cents. The goal was to get it down to about 10 cents, but this was a significant step along the way. And coming to the problem, back to the problem of obesity, we've tried to take a whole variety of novel approaches to enhance impact of the core studies that I referred to earlier. For example, we partnered with HBO documentaries to create a series of programs, documentary, entertaining, storytelling programs on the challenge of obesity. We called it The Weight of the Nation. It involved the CDC and the NIH as well as partners. We garnered support from a variety of sources, but particularly from the Kaiser Permanente Foundation and also from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundations to support this effort. And we produced the documentaries and then a spin-off series of children's documentaries. And I can tell you that the series garnered 4 Emmy nominations. It was very satisfying, and it's become for us a very important prelude to a new idea in which we are trying to promote more effective use of the media in what we call a healthy America, but which could well be a healthy Canada or just a healthy Ottawa. And the basic idea is to focus on a relatively small number of critical things that each of us can do, that we can create the environment to encourage and that individuals can make choices around obesity and diet, around things like physical activity, around the elimination of tobacco, around the problem of excess and inappropriate alcohol use, and around establishing better social connection. A handful of things that if we could accomplish them would really make substantial impact on the burden of chronic disease. The other activities here, the Smart Bites program is kind of interesting. It was actually suggested by a teenager in one of our communities, and essentially what it is a program for education and discount cards for getting healthier choices when you go into a restaurant or fast food place. And it's now being spread to 3 different communities. We'll see how it works, and we'll try to promote it more widely. Victor's Garden is a book designed for educators and children. It has an educational guide. It's in English and Spanish, and it's intended also to promote better choices in diet and in lifestyle for children. So the Institute of Medicine is not only sitting around tables like this and trying to think about things, it's also trying to create the change that we're recommending in the world. Another area where we're bringing people together to solve problems themselves is through the forums and roundtables that bring all of these actors from government, from industry, from health services and other places, so that they can determine for themselves what they want to do. One example was a product that was called the CEO Checklist for High-Value Healthcare. And that was a very important initiative on the part of about a dozen major academic health center CEOs and what they were doing, and it's become now a formal paper and also a source of great discussion and spread around the U.S. And finally, I just want to illustrate what some consider the kind of signature contributions of the Institute of Medicine, where we set out the fundamental blueprint to meet health needs. And I'll just cite these 3 kind of foundational studies. Studies on safety in healthcare, we called To Err is Human. Studies on quality of healthcare, the initial foundational study, Crossing the Quality Chasm. And just last year, a study on value, which is the idea of combining the quality of care with efficiency in the delivery of care, and a report called Best Care at Lower Cost that outlined a path to continuously learning healthcare in the United States. And these kinds of studies are each followed by a whole family of activities. Again, reinforcing this point that if your business is to affect change, you cannot expect a single effort, no matter how well grounded in science and evidence, to make all of the difference. So, just to summarize these 8 purposes, the Institute of Medicine brings new science to long-standing problems, confronts controversial questions of science and policy, illuminates topics that are neglected and demand notice, attends to the needs of vulnerable population, conducts evaluations to guide future programs, recommends standards to protect health, fosters innovative approaches to very complicated health problems, and lays out the blueprint to meet fundamental health needs. It's an ambitious agenda, it's an important agenda, but it's one that has stood over time to be the critical result of a good idea to bring ideas to power. If I look over the long term and ask, what is it that's made the most difference, I would cite two fundamental features. First, I believe that the special relationship to the decision makers in government is a very important part of this effort. That relationship I describe as arm's length tightly clasped. We stay connected, but we also stay apart. And it means we have to be relevant. We have to be able to do things in a timely way. We have to take on the questions that matter to those who are responsible for making decisions. But we can't stop there either. We need to take on questions that the government is not yet prepared to take up. An example we cited earlier was the question of end-of-life care in the United States, a very important and challenging question. And we have to have the relationship that keeps that independence in the way we appoint the committees, carry out our processes, achieve our findings, conclusions, and recommendations. The second really key ingredient for long-term success, and really what everything rests upon, is the reputation for integrity and for quality, because that's what determines the credibility of the organization and its work, and that's what underlies any influence it may have. Some of the processes I described help to protect that reputation, the very close attention to conflict of interest and to bias, the independent reviews that we go through before any report is final. The fact that everyone who works on a study is a volunteer and is serving without pay. It's wonderful for me to be able to take a committee chair to a congressional hearing and be able to introduce them and explain, and as you know, Senator or Representative, Dr. X served without any compensation. That is a very important feature. And finally, openness. Everything I've talked about, in fact, anything that the Institute of Medicine has produced, is freely available to everyone as a free downloaded PDF file through our website and at the National Academies. And so we try to maintain an openness in both the fact and the spirit of the work that we do. I hope that we can learn from our own experience and to be a place that does continuously improve. I hope that we can learn from others' experience and to adopt the best practices and best learning from what you here in Canada are doing and what others around the world are attempting. And I believe fundamentally that the ideas of the National Academies and their role as independent, science-based advisors can make a real difference for health and for society. Thank you all very much.
Please let me be the first to thank Dr. Fineberg for his talk to us today, for speaking with us. And can I also say, just to extend it slightly, to thank you for doing so in a different forum, and that is something that I consider very important, is the concept of speaking truth to power. And in your role at the Institute of Medicine, you do that so that you speak the same way that you spoke to us to people who have power, something that's extremely important. I want to congratulate you also on winning the Friesen Prize, and in so doing, can I bring somebody who needs no introduction to the stage now, Henry Friesen, to give some comments on what you said.
Thank you very much, Paul. It seems superfluous for me to make any significant comments about the presentation. I think we've been witness to an extraordinary presentation that illustrates once yet again how individuals make a difference. At the core of the presentation, I think we could not help but be impressed by the power of the idea that was launched by President Lincoln and ultimately evolved with the creation of the Institute of Medicine, and how significant the evolution of that institute has been under President Fineberg's leadership. His powerful intellect, his insatiable curiosity, his boundless quest for deeper understanding, and the breadth of interest. Truly, the President is the man for all seasons in this case. Your ability to anticipate the future, as we looked at the agenda, the very ambitious agenda that you set when you took office, but which you pursue with continued passion and curiosity, with the ultimate objective to achieve and advance bold ideas. And you've presented today your reflections and your synthesis and conclusions with remarkable eloquence. You've, in a sense, inspired us to dream with you about a better, more healthy futures. Where others often saw problems, you, in fact, saw possibilities. And your success was not yours alone, but it was in partnership with many others, and the importance of volunteers was something that you emphasized. One of the early presidents of the United States said, "Leaders inspire us to dream more, to learn more, to do more, and to become more." And during your tenure, you have transformed many of those dreams into realities by marshaling the best scientific evidence, and through these we have learned more. And implicit in that exercise of learning is now a framework to pursue paths that are right to effect the changes that have been envisaged. And if as a country and as a society we pursue with excellence the right choices that you have outlined, we too will become more. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me finally say thank you in this public forum to all of those who have had a part in the Friends of CIHR and in creating this prize, and of course, most notably, Dr. Angel. Your attention to detail, your concern, and as I was reminded of the list of prior winners, the excellence with which you have carried out and conducted your office is exemplary, and for that, I and all of us in this audience are most grateful. Thank you very much.
I think it's only appropriate at this time to bring Abby Angel to the stage to give a few words to perhaps conclude the afternoon.
Thank you very much. I can't expand on Dr. Friesen's comments about Dr. Fineberg. Outstanding, exceptional, both giants. It's wonderful that you're both here. My duty now is to adjourn the proceedings and invite you to a brief reception out at the back hall. There will be awards from CSCI. And it's also an opportunity to thank all the people and groups that have participated in the collaboration with Friends of CIHR, with the Canadian Academy, to bring this to you annually. We'll adjourn now, the forum. Some of us will be partying later on, but everybody will be welcome to enjoy a glass of something out there. So thanks again, and we'll see you again next time. We are adjourned.